Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Projects Manager. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this very special Zoominar. Moment is pleased to host today's program to honor the memory of Elie Wiesel, who co-founded the magazine 45 years ago with writer Leonard Fein. I know we have a lot of people watching from around the world, and I wanted to give a special welcome to those from the Jewish community in Cape Town, South Africa. Please note that today's conversation is being recorded and will be posted online in a few days. Towards the end of the session, you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. Following today's program, you can purchase our new book, Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy, at momentmag.com, where you can also subscribe to the magazine. We ask that you consider making a donation to help support our ongoing effort to bring you more opportunities like today's conversation. Please join us again next Tuesday, July 7th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time for a program on gender issues in Israel. You can register for this upcoming Zoominar and watch our previous programs by visiting momentmag.com. Now for today's special conversation with Elisha Wiesel, Lessons from My Father, the Teachings of Elie Wiesel Remembered. Elisha is a recovering Wall Street executive who raised millions of dollars for New York's neediest by convening hundreds of finance professionals to stay up all night solving elaborate puzzles on the city streets. Having retired from a 25-year financial markets career at the end of 2019, Elisha then served as the technology lead for digital marketing in the Mike Bloomberg presidential campaign. He is now using his time in quarantine to learn Metallica songs on guitar from his son, to learn TikTok dances from his daughter, to organize his father's archives, to learn a little Talmud every day, and to obey his wife and mother. When his father passed, Elisha realized that many others missed his voice, and so he now speaks from time to time about his father's legacy and message when the right opportunities arise for impact. Joining Elisha today is Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief of Moment Magazine. Nadine is also the editor of Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Please welcome Elisha Wiesel and Nadine Epstein.
Good afternoon, everyone, from Washington, D.C. And 4 years ago today, Elie died, and millions of people all over the world felt his loss, and I did. I mean, I knew he was sick, but I was still shocked. For me, he was someone I met when I took over Moment, which was 16 years ago. He was a friend, a fellow journalist. He was someone who encouraged me. He always made time for me. He was someone from whom I learned from his very way of being. He was a man of great kindness. I loved how he started every conversation with me with, "What can I do for you?" It's a very rare way to start a conversation with. Very few people start conversations like that. He was someone who didn't criticize, at least I never felt criticized, but he kind of taught me by unconditional support. Instead of saying, "I don't like what you did," or "I don't like this story," he always said, "You're doing a wonderful job. You are helping the Jewish community express the tumult of Jewish thought." And it was something that I really needed to hear at the time. And I loved his graciousness. And I wanted to say a little bit about that before I just introduce somebody who really knew him in a way that none of us could. And that's Elisha, his son. We're so pleased that you're here with us today and that you're taking time to talk to us about your dad. Thank you just so much for joining us. So I thought I'd start out with a very kind of a question maybe that's on everyone's mind. What was it like growing up to be the son of Elie Wiesel? Do you have some special memory that somehow encapsulates that?
Look, it's, I think if you were to ask anyone who grew up as the son of a famous person, there are a lot of challenges that can be involved with that. Public figures cast long shadows, even in their home, and it can be very difficult to sort of find one's way through that. But, the memory that I have of my father was, as you said, incredibly warm, incredibly gracious. he was the father who didn't get angry, but he would be disappointed, and that was always worse. Because if you made him feel sad, you just felt terrible. Here was this wonderful human being, and if something you did made him sad, it was not a good feeling. But he was an incredible father, and I think that, I was going through some of the old pictures you asked me to put together. I mean, they took me all over the world, and so much of what I picked up by osmosis is really thanks to him. And the thing I want to focus on the most when you ask what I remember of him is really the way he was a father, this kind, gentle person who never had anything mean to say, really, about anyone.
Is there one thing that you miss the most about your dad as a dad?
My father would just give these incredible warm hugs, and his face would light up when we were together as a family. And he was so eager to ask me questions about what was going on in my life, or tell me what he was up to. And he never understood my career. So, the questions he was able to ask were not particularly deep questions about the world of finance. But he would try, he would ask about the people that he'd heard of. And he got a big, kick out of that.
So I guess, I know you're not your dad, and I know you can't be in your dad's mind, but could you speculate about what he would be thinking about today? Here we are, it's the summer of 2020. Perhaps it's good that he's missed all this. We've had a resurgence in anti-Semitism. We are in the midst of a pandemic. Polarization within and beyond the Jewish community is more extreme than ever before. We have coming up what might be the most important presidential election of our time, of our lifetimes. What would your dad be thinking today?
Listen, my father, first of all, I think he's still plenty busy up above arguing our case in the heavenly court. So although I think he's resting, I don't think he's, fully retired. And I think that, he's earned us not having to speculate what he would have thought. But I can tell you what I've internalized from his message, and those messages and how they make me view things, which is not quite the same as me speculating as to what he would have said. I think he had very relevant messages. I think he had a message that said, don't be silent. Silence helps the oppressor, never the victim. And I think if you were to look at where we are in 2020, I mean, do you know anybody who's silent these days? If you look at your social media feed, do you feel like you have a lot of silent friends who are really keeping their thoughts to themselves? Or do you feel that we may have turned a corner on indifference in some way, where nobody is indifferent to some set of causes that they feel passionately about? And if anything, it's very hard to find silence or listening or real exchange of views. And what you find is people who've moved so far past indifferent that they're shouting kind of nonstop. I think that, the world of social media has taken us there, these polarized echo chambers. And I think that, when you think of the legacy of my father, there's two very important components. Political activism absolutely was a core part of his legacy, finding a voice for things that one cares about when one sees an opportunity for justice in the world. But my father did all these things, and he did them in a way that was never judging or shaming or hurtful. I think we've lost that to some extent in this country, particularly within the Jewish community. I look at my social media feed and I see a liberal friend of mine who I otherwise deeply respect saying that when, attacks happen and Jews are killed, that, right-wing Jews have blood on their hands. That's a real quote. And I have friends who, on the right, who will say things like left-wing Jews are traitors if they're going to compromise the security of Israel. That doesn't sound to me like constructive, helpful dialogue. There are real reasons why, people have the views that they do, and you hope that they're reasoned and you hope that they're informed. But the only way that those views will ever grow and accommodate larger truths is by a real exchange of information and by some degree of mutual respect. And I think that we've lost that, and I think he would be saddened by that.
Let me read something that you wrote today on social media that I thought was really beautiful. It's very short. If you remember my father, then remember the softness that was his strength. If you hear his admonition that silence helps the oppressor and take it to heart, then know as well that he knew how to be silent when the temptation was to judge, or shame, or to say something hurtful. If you remember my father, may you find your voice for the justice that you envision, and may you find that place of silence too. And I think you said it very beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Nadine.
So one of the things that I found that your dad was very tactful, and he did choose his words very carefully, and he chose who he said those words to carefully. And
What he didn't say is almost as much a part of his legacy as what he did.
Yes. But then when I guess, and this was something we were talking about a little bit yesterday, he chose very specifically when he wasn't going to speak, when silence hadn't worked, or when tact hadn't worked, or when talking behind the scenes was not successful. And I think one of those examples was Bitburg. I
Sure.
thought maybe tell us a little bit about, first of all, a lot of young people, lots of people, not just young people, don't even remember Bitburg, but what was it about Bitburg? Tell us a little bit about the story of Bitburg and your dad.
Sure. Look, you know, in a few weeks, there was a certain timeline in the mid-'80s where my father was due to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor. And it was a few weeks before President Reagan, at Helmut Kohl's request, was going to go visit a cemetery in Germany. And at the moment, there was a very, important political objective for the United States to really befriend West Germany. Reagan really had his sights on ending the Cold War definitively, and this was a major part of it on the global stage. And my father really begged him when he found out that there were going to be SS graves at the Bitburg Cemetery. My father entreated in every way he could to President Reagan to change his mind and not do that. And, it's interesting. It ends up being one of my father's most famous speeches, him standing there and lecturing President Reagan that this place is not your place. Very powerful words. But I don't think my father wanted to be in a spotlight saying powerful words that he would be remembered for. He didn't want to humiliate a sitting president. He didn't want to humiliate anyone. That wasn't his way. He would have been much, much happier if, his discussions directly with the president and his staff had borne fruit, and the whole thing could have been avoided.
Which brings me to something else that I've always thought about your dad, is he was a wonderful listener, and which is a quality that we are losing. People know their opinions. We're also sure of our opinions. It's very hard for us to listen to people who are on the other side, or on any side, and there's so many sides. And one of the things I found about your dad is that he was willing to listen to almost anyone who wanted to come talk to him.
But not just listen to arguments. I mean, the amazing thing about my father was he was a relatively busy man. I can say that because, I saw him growing up, and, I remember it was for him to take, half an hour out of his day to kick a soccer ball with me, or to throw a ball that I could hit, with a baseball bat. Like that was he did it, and he did it lovingly, but it was a big ask. Yet somehow, he made the time for everybody who had a story to share. And I particularly saw this later in life, whether it was a hairdresser who wanted to, explain how they'd gotten from Nicaragua to the United States, or it was someone from overseas in the Middle East who had a tale about how they got Jewish, not Jewish. It didn't matter. My father always had time to hear someone's story and make them feel heard. And he would stand in that receiving line after the 92nd Street Y lecture, which he gave for so many decades. And he really would just keep going until there was a sense that, people had been satiated, that whatever they wanted from him or to share with him had been shared. My father believed in human dignity and extending it in the personal context.
So how did he choose his issues? Because there were so many issues, and there are some issues that he did speak up about, and there are other ones that he didn't. And tell us a little bit about your insight into that.
Sure. Look, I think, first of all, you have to remember that when it comes to issues and how my family engaged, it's not just my dad. You have to remember he had a teammate, his most important partner in life, my mother, Marion Wiesel. And really, this was their life's work together to decide their issues. When they received money from the Nobel Prize and immediately launched the foundation, the very first thing that in focus, there were immediately two things that were done. One was a body of work around launching conferences, a belief in the power of dialogue. And my mother helped tremendously in that, but my father really had, this was something he brought as a pre-existing desire. If you look though at where the bulk of the programming funds were really being spent though, it was on my mother's dream, which was that, she herself, having been a proud NAACP carrying member upon her arrival to the United States in the 50s, she saw racism and was disgusted by it. She marched in the South, and she had made the determination that with the immigration of Ethiopian Jews with a different skin color into Israel in the mid-'80s, she felt this was the right time to invest, and through the creation of after-school programming and otherwise educational programming, to prevent that sort of racism from taking hold in Israel, the way it had in the United States. So that was really her passion. And so you have to look at them as a team to understand what it was that they were so focused on, issues of racial equality. My father, for him, genocide was always, a number one thing. And if you look at whether it was for Rwanda or for Bosnia, his begging of US presidents to get more involved, that we should have a stronger foreign affairs policy platform in that regard. And, then you also look at cases where it was about helping his fellow Jew. And, the Soviet Jewry case is the one that I personally remember as a child, right? The chant of 2468, let my people emigrate. As a young person, that's probably the first political chant I ever heard, and it has stuck with me. And it was incredibly successful. But it was an easier time then, in the sense of, I think, for that particular cause, there really were very clearly good guys and there were bad guys. All right, the communist government in the Kremlin really was bad. They were preventing freedom of expression of religion, and they were torturing people who just wanted to reclaim their Jewish identity. I think on causes that were much more nuanced and truly political, where there were many different viewpoints on the best way to do it, my father was more hesitant. He didn't like being somebody uninformed and holding forth.
Well, I guess it brings us to Israel, which is a much more complicated issue.
All roads lead to Israel.
All roads lead to Israel. And I know your dad was a very passionate Zionist. But explain how he dealt with the complications of Israel.
And again, I have to discuss, both my parents. My mother was as committed and is as committed a Zionist as one has ever seen. She actually took great pride in receiving the Jabotinsky Award from I think it was from the ADL, the only one ever created just for her. But, my father was a deeply committed Zionist. He gets criticism, I think, from the left because of that, because he put out articles saying Jerusalem, has to remain the eternal capital of the Jewish people. On the other hand, in 2006 in Petra, Jordan, he and my mother organized a conference with King Abdullah, and actually, got Olmert and Abu Mazen to meet. So he definitely wanted to see progress. He aspired to peace, but he also felt very strongly that as an American Jew, it wasn't his place to tell Israel what to do, that the Israelis who lived there, whose children were in the army and putting their lives on the line, the parents who had to worry about a suicide bombing at a Sbarro's, these were the people who day in and day out were experiencing the trade-offs between security and peace, and that only they living there could decide what the right path was. And that's a belief he had as long as I knew him.
So, by the way, just Jabotinsky actually wrote for the First Moment.
Ha!
Der Moment. Der Moment was an independent newspaper in 1910 to 1939 that your dad did not read, but your grandfather, Shlomo, read.
Interesting.
And so that's the whole story about, so Moment is named after Der Moment, and which was very independent, but then later on Jabotinsky started writing for it. It became a little less, it changed its political points of view.
Mm-hmm.
But why, so one question is something that I've thought a lot about, but why did your dad after he lived in France, after the Holocaust, he could have moved to Israel. He did go
Yeah.
and write stories about Israel, but he became a young foreign correspondent. But what was it that drew him to New York instead of Israel?
Well, there's two questions there. First of all, the reason he never lived in Israel that he told me is he could never get any work done there. So start with a man who already is extremely generous with his time, as we discussed earlier. And now you multiply that by 100 when he's in Israel. Because if he was generous with his time, you know, among his fellow American citizens, surrounded by Jews, he, you know, his schedule would collapse. So he would always say that I don't know if he just didn't have the self-control, you know, to do that. But in Israel, he just felt that his time collapsed and it was very difficult for him to get work done. In terms of what drew him to New York, look, you have to remember, my father was a passionate and loyal American citizen. He loved this country. We would have arguments when I was a teenager. I remember when the flag burning amendment came out, and I was, you know, going to a nice liberal college campus. I was like, of course it's free speech to burn a flag. And my father got very silent at the table. And he said, do you know what that flag meant to those of us who were rescued by it and under her? Do you have any idea what it means to us? And can you imagine what it means to those men and women and their families where they paid the ultimate price, whether it was to save us or pursue justice around the world? He had a very deep patriotism that often overwrote things like ideals of free speech. I'm not saying I agree with him, but it moves me greatly that he was so connected to the country. And you have to remember, my father was a stateless person. He had been, you know, hit by a taxi in New York. He'd missed the window to renew his immigration visa because he was here working for Yidiot at covering the United Nations. And he was like, I need to renew my visa. And try to imagine this in the modern day, but a customs officer went to him and said, you know, you can become a citizen, and clued him in to the thought that he could become a citizen. My father was, what, me? And he felt so passionately about that passport that he carried. I remember coming back from trips abroad, and we would land at JFK Airport in New York. My father, who was not the most emotional guy, you actually would see his eyes kind of moisten when the customs officer at JFK would say, welcome home. The thought that he had a home.
Wow. So what did your dad say to you when you came home from college with what was it, a blue mohawk?
Sure. I don't know what color it was. It was colorful. My father was incredibly tolerant. I think that in part because he had a very keen sense of the burden that was placed on me as an only son.
An only child.
I'm sorry?
Oh yeah, you're his only child.
I have an older half sister, Jennifer, thankfully,
okay.
From my mother's previous marriage.
Okay.
But really an only son in that marriage, and my father's only son. And, you know, he felt very keenly that there was a tremendous weight that he had placed on me. The weight not only of him having survived the Holocaust and what that meant, that he had chosen life and chosen to have a family, and the horrors that he had endured, that my grandparents had been wiped out on that side of the family. But he also felt, I think, very keenly a sense of weight of the generations from a Jewish perspective, that through some miracle, my father and his faith had somehow emerged from the other side of the Shoah. And what meant more to him than anything was that that line should continue. And he felt it was very unfair that he had put me in this position where I had to shoulder all of that weight of being the only one. My father had two sisters who survived the Shoah, and they went on and had, you know, amazing children, my cousins, who I love dearly. But my father felt that his line was all on me, and it was a terrific burden, and he recognized that. So when I came home and did things he didn't necessarily appreciate or approve of, or things that he would not have chosen to do, he had an incredibly accepting attitude. And, you know, it's something that when I think of my father now, I think of this incredible, overwhelming feeling of being loved. This is a person who truly loved me unconditionally. And that's an amazing thing to take with you throughout one's life. I'm very blessed to have it.
So how did you influence your father? We had this American son who I see, and who's evolved a great deal from the kid that he was. But how did you influence him? What did he learn from you?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think on the surface, he learned things like how to try to throw a baseball. I had to prep him for throwing the opening pitch, I think, for game 3, of the Mets Red Sox series in '86. And so I taught him that much at least. But I think I pushed his envelopes of what modernity meant. I think that having me bring home punk rock and heavy metal and having me bring home my crazy college friends who were, all had their own ideas, and creating a lively table that he could hear and learn from. He always loved meeting my friends and hearing what they thought about life and where they came from. I think I stretched his component. I think that, he was nervous about being a father. He had grave misgivings because, he had this quote of, why should I bring a Jewish child into the world when, the world does such terrible things to Jewish children? But that was a deep philosophical misgiving. I think he also had, the nervousness that every father feels of, how do I parent? What am I going to do now? Oh my God, I have a child dependent on me who I have to educate and provide for. And I think that in all the ways that modernity informs us, I was a vessel for that in some important ways. And in the movies that I would bring into, or the things we would watch together, or the books we would discuss, yeah, he was always open. I took him to the Rocky Horror Picture Show in the early 90s. Can you imagine my father sitting through the Rocky Horror Picture Show
Good for you.
Doing, every single line of, the audience repertoire.
I'm
he
on
was
up
a
to my
patient
lab.
man.
He was on the slab. Yes, I can just see it. That's oh my gosh.
Anticipation.
Just that your dad went, like my dad, he's 99. I don't think he would have joined me for that. So that's incredible that your dad did that.
I'm sure he was thinking about something more important the entire time, but he showed up.
That's very special. It's very special. So, one of the reasons, like actually, when we interviewed Father Dubois as part of the book that we did, and his dad, he wrote something. He said, "I believe there is a risk that Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust, and other genocides will be forgotten. Elie was a light in the night for the whole world, not just the Jewish one. We should remember him." And I do find, well, in the old days when I used to go places and took Ubers and got on planes and talked to people and talked to everybody, that a lot of people don't know who your dad is. And even in the Jewish world, and if they know who he is, he's just like another famous name. He might know maybe vaguely about night. And so I guess what do we need to do to keep your dad from not being forgotten?
It's a great question. And I think that, with my father, there's a written tradition, and I think there's an oral tradition. In terms of the written tradition, I think his works stand on their own. He was a prolific writer. I think his books are still often taught, especially night in schools. And for all that I agree with you, there are people who don't know him. I can't tell you how many emails I get from school teachers of 7th and 8th grade classrooms here in Israel, overseas, and other parts of Europe, who reach out and want to engage with me because they're teaching night to their classroom. So I think it is actually still happening. I think his written tradition is alive. I think night is still being read. I think that there is also an oral tradition, though, of who my father was as a human being. And in many ways, that's the one that I'm more worried about getting lost. Look, I think that things will come and go. There will be, and we have room to do our own work in terms of advocating for Holocaust education as being a critical part of statewide requirements. And, there are organizations out there who are doing incredible work in that regard, Facing History being, one of the more prominent among them. But it's the oral tradition I'm more worried about, because the number of people who knew my father face to face and knew that he wasn't just someone who had a story to tell, who had a life lesson to impart, who wasn't just a figure on the global stage who spoke to presidents and tried to awaken the moral conscience of the planet, but here was somebody who lived some of these most core Jewish values that he held so dearly. The phrase is derech eretz, how to treat people. My father's derech eretz was unbelievable. He treated people well and with respect, and he brought smiles to their faces, and he wanted to kindle curiosity in them, and he wanted to kindle compassion within them. And he was a curious mind as well. He was truly hungry for knowledge, to learn about the person he was speaking with and to understand their perspective. I'm more worried about that oral tradition disappearing because there's only so many of us who knew him face to face, and that's why moments like these that you've organized today, I'm so passionate about taking the time to participate in.
Yes, I feel actually when I came home from the funeral and I had nobody to talk to him about because nobody here in my little world in DC knew him, I actually came right home and then I read Somewhere a Master, Hasidic Portraits and Legends, and it made me feel like I was with him. Although I didn't have big conversations with him about depths of Judaism or history, we always talked about journalism and the world and other things. But it made me feel like I could hear his voice.
Look, I think you were one of his students, and it's been a great blessing for me, really, since my father passed, to get to know some of my father's students better. Ariel Berger has become a dear friend. He wrote a book about his experiences in the classroom that I think is really a part of that oral tradition, being written down in the same way that, finally the Mishnah got written down, 1900 years ago. I think about, friends like Avram Cohen and teachers who taught with him like Carolyn Johnston. There's a real chavrusa there. There's a real group of people who knew him well and are finding their voice and sharing, what he was like and what they want to pass on from that tradition. But I'm glad you brought Somewhere a Master. His Hasidic stories are among my favorite. And, my father cared a lot about his Judaism. He was a blend of the particular and the universal. And when I do this little bit of Talmud study that I do every day, and the rabbis are arguing or debating a point or telling a story, I can, in my mind's eye, my father is sitting there at the table with them.
So the other thing I actually found about your dad is that he had a very mischievous kind of side. He had this like mischievous twinkle in his eye when I was talking to him, and for all sorts of things. He didn't actually make jokes. I'm not sure that he was a joke guy, and you can tell us a little bit more about that. But there was something that he was there was some kind of laughing going on in there and I don't know if you found that or if that's just my impression.
My father loved comedy, and he loved chocolate, but he loved comedy too. It's funny, in an era of cancel culture, picture, if you will, my father watching The Producers, Mel Brooks, The Producers, and just guffawing, like, belly laughs, just like, as they sing Springtime for Hitler. Like my father, this is, it's a little bit of a jarring image, but my father, it's worth keeping in mind as we all think about, how do we define taste, and what should be removed, and what should be canceled, and what can be seen, and what jokes are okay. My father ultimately had a very powerful sense of humor, and one that he loved engaging with.
Well, one thing he always said to me is that Moment was very tasteful. Like he did want things to be tasteful when they were conversations about the Jewish world or about politics. And I never experienced that. I never watched, Blazing Saddles with him. Although I think he once told me that his favorite movie was North by Northwest, or he was loved that movie. It was something like that. So
no, it's a war movie.
Oh yes,
it's not Bridge on the River Kwai. If my mother was on, she'd remind me immediately. The Guns of Navarone.
Yes, The Guns of Navarone. That's it. Yes. And I was like, it is? And yes, and then I was like, what? That's your favorite movie? I didn't, it just seemed so incongruous. So, so have you? I know that. Well, first, let me just ask, how would he like to be remembered? How do you think your dad would like to be remembered?
Very, very simple, because he and I had this conversation many times.
Okay.
My father wanted to be remembered first and foremost as a good Jew. And there was so much that got packed into that, I think. He wanted to be remembered as a good Jew, carrying on the tradition of his father and his father before him, and all the way back. He felt so deeply rooted in the multi-thousand-year history of the Jewish people, and that was critical to him. I think he wanted to be remembered as a good Jew, as someone who was deeply loyal to the concept of being a good person, of someone who was able to treat other people well. He thought that that was a defining characteristic of being a good Jew. And he thought, by the way, that this came from a set of conversations we had back when I would challenge him when I was 19, 20 years old. I'd say, okay, Dad, but like for me, would you rather I be good or would you rather be a Jew? I'd be a Jew. Isn't being good more important? And, because I was in a headspace of maybe I'll become a Zen Buddhist. Maybe I should, who knows what I want to do with my life? Why Judaism? Why should I have to pick this path when there's so many other interesting paths at the shopping mall, for religious belief or persuasion? And he said he couldn't separate them. It was like you couldn't split the atom. Like for him, the atomic unit was good Jew. They went together. And he would say, a good Jew, if you are a Jew, then you should aspire to be a good Jew. If you're a Christian, then aspire to be a good Christian. If you're a Muslim, aspire to be a good Christian. Why is that so complicated? Honor your past and embrace it and develop it and take ownership of it and make it yours, but do it from that place. My father really, really cared about keeping Judaism alive on the forward. I think that was very important. And then the last piece that I'll mention was he thought that being a good Jew meant operating outside the Jewish sphere. I think he felt that meant bringing Jewish values to outside the community and achieving a goal of operating in the universal sphere, but from a base of the particular.
Yes, yes. Well, also, didn't he tell you that you could do anything you want in the world, but you had to marry you had to marry a Jewish woman? Was it that?
Yes.
Yes.
That he only put 2 requirements. So, by the way, I do believe he gave me unconditional love. So I don't think these were conditions to his love, but
Yeah.
I think that these were conditions to his happiness,
Uh-huh.
which are different. And the first was he wanted me to marry Jewish. He was very clear he would accept, a conversion to halakha. It didn't need to be somebody who was born Jewish, but somebody with a Jewish neshama who discovered it later in life and converted, he was totally fine with. And that was incredibly important to him. He, by the way, he stressed that mostly with me. He was still very warm. If he had intermarried students who, in his classroom, he'd be just as warm and embracing of them. He would never let them feel any less. But he was very clear for me for what he thought was the right thing for the Jewish people and that he wanted me to be part of. He felt very strongly that intermarriage was something that was unfortunately, contributing to problems for the Jewish people. The second thing,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
You go ahead.
No, and then the second thing he asked me to do for me in his lifetime was he asked me to say Kaddish, after his passing, and he was clear he didn't want it to be just going to Yizkor on Yom Kippur or Shavuos. He really wanted me to say regular Kaddish for him and go every day, and I did. And the thing is, I'd made a mistake because at first I thought he was asking me to do something for him, and I really only realized later he was giving me a gift. This was him doing something for me.
So I know now that you've retired, you've been going through his papers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about some things that you've found that you didn't know about or that you might want to share with us.
Look, I found everything from, letters from the Lubavitch Rebbe. And I know I'm never going to see the other side of that correspondence because so many people corresponded with a Rebbe. He viewed them all as private and sacred and never wanted to betray anyone's trust. So I think those letters will stay at 770, I think, for all knowable eternity. But they're amazing letters. They're letters of my father, prevailing upon my father to marry. And, we took one of those letters and put it into the bencher for my son's bar mitzvah a few years ago, because it's beautiful. He says, even if they're Vizhnitzer and not Lubavitch, what matters to me is that you should defeat Hitler by making sure that the Jewish people thrive. And what this means is that you have to marry and you have to have Jewish children and Jewish grandchildren. And so that's a beautiful set of letters. I found a notebook from when he was 13 or 14, really just before the war in Siget, with all sorts of Kabbalistic incantations. He was, well beyond what his father's comfort zone was for him to do in terms of research into Jewish mysticism. So you have these notebooks with, alternating shopping lists and Kabbalistic, angel names. So yeah, there's a lot there. There's correspondence, and there's memoirs, and there's manuscripts, and every so often I just find something that I pick up, and then it has incredible meaning for me in that moment, and I'm hearing his voice, and it's a very powerful experience to do that.
Have you discovered something new about him that you didn't know about him in the process?
I found that he had love letters written to him before my mother, but I'm not going to comment on from who.
Well, that happens to we find that about everyone, all of our parents. Well, I want to leave a little time for people's questions, because I can see there's quite a few questions. But before we do, I know you brought us a few photos, and I thought we could spend a minute, you could just show us the photos and tell us a little bit about them before we turn this back to Suzanne, and she shares some of the questions.
That's great.
Okay. So here's the first picture.
I wish I actually knew when that exact photo was taken. I think it was right around 73. I hope my mom dialed into the call, but I don't think she's going to be unmuted, so she can't tell us. But I think that was in 73 in Israel. Supposedly, my father said that there's a recording that he made for me, an audio recording of his thoughts, because he went there for the Yom Kippur War. He flew there.
Really?
And he has recordings of, he was worried that those might be his last moments. And he said he made me recordings, but I could never find those audio recordings that he made in the Yom Kippur War.
Oops, sorry.
But it's a classic picture from my father, a passionate defender of Israel.
Oh my gosh, what a gorgeous photo.
This is wedding day. My parents were married by my father's Rabbi, Shaul Lieberman, who he loved so dearly. And that's, my mom and my dad getting married at the Western Wall.
That's a beautiful, I've seen this one, it's beautiful.
I think that's in Israel. I'm not 100% sure. What I remember most about, I think it was this trip to Israel. The most important thing that happened to me was Mark Hamill, who was Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars series, was filming for another movie. And I convinced my father to go up to him, or maybe it was my mother, and they went up to him and asked for his autograph.
Oh my gosh.
I believe that this photo was actually in the Soviet Union when I accompanied my parents for a visit to Moscow and Kiev, where my parents were bringing, I believe, Sidurim and Machzorim and other Sifrei Kedusha to those in need so they could practice the Jewish religion. And this was against the law. And I remember it was scary. And I have very dim memories of being chased around the subway lines in Moscow and being told we have to move quickly. There's a KGB guy behind us. I don't know if they were just playing with me, but I don't know. I have memories of that as a young person. And I think this was at the great shul in Moscow, if I'm not incorrect.
I'll have to ask your mom. Maybe she remembers the details of that one. Oh my God, that's so sweet.
I am pretty sure this is at a Jewish cemetery or memorial. I think possibly near Treblinka or one of the camps in Poland. Yeah, I wish I knew for sure. These are very old photos.
Did you go back to Siget with your dad?
I went back to Siget once with my father and my cousin Steve, who is like a brother to me. That's his sister's B's son. And that was an incredible trip. That was in 1995. And then I returned to Siget, I guess it might have even been last year with my son. And
is this Elijah here?
This is Elijah. This is my son Elijah in the arms of his grandfather. And there they are opening a Gemara. I'm not sure which one.
Oh, in the office, yes.
Yeah. There's my father delighted with his grandson and granddaughter. That's Elijah and Shira.
And that's it.
And then there's this incredible, I don't know who wrote this, but it's amazing. Who could have put this together?
I didn't write it, I edited it, and we talked to so many people, and it was a really fascinating way to get to know your dad on a whole different level. So by talking to so many people who've known him over the years. Well, we could talk a lot more, and maybe we'll have to do part 2 at another time, but we have a few minutes left for so many questions. So first of all, over to you, Suzanne.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. What I will tell you is that the majority of the people have just been sending such love for your father and such appreciation to you.
Deeply appreciated.
For continuing to share the stories. People feel very lucky to be a part of this today. We have people from New Jersey, Kansas, Mumbai, and I will share these with you later. So, but I just wanted to let you know.
Don't forget Cape Town.
And Cape Town, yes. But I just wanted to let you know that it just keeps pouring in. But let's get to some of the questions. When did you first learn about your parents' past? And when did you realize that he was famous because of all of that?
Great question.
It's a great question. I feel like, I don't know when it all congealed for me. I think relatively late, like maybe age 11 or 12. I think before that, I had a concept of my father was a victim of a terrible crime. And I remember that being challenging because I'd be out at the playground and one friend would say, my daddy is an Air Force pilot for the Israeli army. And another kid would say, oh, my father is a pharmacist. He makes people feel better. And I'd say, I don't know, something really bad happened to my father and now he's a teacher. So I really didn't understand it as a very young person. I think it was later. I think a lot of the Holocaust education was all by osmosis, by traveling with them, by spending, summer or winter vacation and, at concentration campsites. I don't think, I really don't remember my father or mother ever sitting me down and saying, here's what you need to know. Here's night. This is what happened to your family. It was really incremental until I built up enough curiosity to pull Night off the shelf and really read it.
Oh, so no one gave it to you. You just found, do you remember how old you were when you decided to pull it off this
I think late in life, I think maybe 12.
Okay.
And then once you really were a little older and you understood what had happened to them, did it ever make you feel different as a kid growing up from the other kids?
I think that having a father who was a huge public figure made me feel different. It was impossible to go through. I went to a modern Orthodox yeshiva, so Judaism and Jewish figures were very prominent. It was a double spotlight. And I think, I can't tell you how many times a teacher would say something like, if I did something bad, it would be, how could an apple fall so far from the tree? People had a conception of who I was supposed to be, and that felt confining, at times.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to know how your parents met.
They met at a party. I believe they were introduced by a friend in New York City.
Okay. Did your father ever encounter Holocaust deniers, and how did he react to them, both emotionally and just in general responding?
My father took Holocaust denial incredibly personally. It, for him, was such an insult. And don't forget, he was physically accosted by a Holocaust denier as well. And a decade ago, he was accosted by a young man in a San Francisco hotel. But my father hated it. He would get these letters and he had a whole dossier he'd built beyond, of every document he possibly had for anybody who claimed that the Holocaust didn't happen or he wasn't there. For him, this was one of the really greatest crimes somebody could commit, would be to challenge the truth of the Holocaust. He viewed it as killing the victims again.
Mm-hmm. And did he, after he had been accosted and all, how did he deal, did he feel it was his mission to start speaking out against them? Did he ever speak out against them?
He's been speaking out against them his whole life. Writing down Night is an act of combating Holocaust denial. I don't think anything changed. I don't think he was like, oh my God, what do we have to do differently? He just kept doing what he was doing, which was telling his life story.
Mm-hmm. And somebody wanted to know, what advice do you think he would give today's youth who are experiencing this rise in anti-Semitism, along with growing up in a world where there's still racism and discrimination?
Gosh, that's a tough one. I always hate speculating what would my father say. Again, I think a message that is consistent with my father's values would be, do not let the Jewish community become divided by hatred. Find a way, if you're a right-wing Jew and you happen to believe that the security of the state of Israel is extremely important, then you know what? You should take pride that there are left-wing Jews who've made it their mission to fight injustice outside of the Jewish community. And yes, you may have views that are different on them, on some things that matter, but you know what? You have to take pride in what your brothers are doing, your brothers and sisters are doing from their vantage point within a more liberal community. And I think if you're a part of a liberal community and you are deeply immersed in these actions of whether you're combating racism domestically in the United States or whether you're speaking out against what China is doing to the Muslim community, you have to take pride that you have a segment of the Jewish people that is so committed to Judaism that they are speaking out and they are committed to a secure, a secure and democratic state of Israel that has defensible borders, and that there are people who care about that because, one day, Israel has extended its doors to all Jews around the world, and you're part of that as well. So I think my father would have preached a message of unity, and I think that that's where his messages are. And all of these things, it's not an exclusive or, it's a false choice to say, can I care about injustices that are happening outside the Jewish community? And can I also be passionately dedicated that there should be a state of Israel, a Jewish state of Israel, that we have as our last haven so that the Shoah can never happen again.
Mm-hmm. And so many people of that generation decided not to speak out. They did not talk about what happened to them. Why do you think your dad took it upon himself to teach the world?
That's an unknowable question. I think my father felt compelled to make his life meaningful. And I think, he had been asked, why did you survive? Did you do something different? My father never felt that he had done something right where others had done something wrong, or that he was smarter, or he certainly never felt he was stronger. He felt it was luck. He felt that the dice could have rolled just as easily and he might not have made it, but he did make it. And his parents and little sister did not, and so many others did not. And he felt a moral obligation to speak on their behalf and to make sure that his life was not thrown away. He wanted it to have impact.
Is there a particular book of your father's that you think deserves to be better known, a book that's been overlooked through the years?
I think that Souls on Fire is an amazing book about Hasidus and the Hasidic masters. And if you want to tap into, again, my father's legacy as a good Jew, which for him meant a literate Jew, a practicing Jew, a Jew who was connected to Yiddishkeit, to Jewish things. Souls on Fire is an amazing book because it taps you into what he loved so much about the great Hasidic masters.
Great, thank you. Well, again, it's time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for sharing today. And we hope that you will join us again to continue the conversation. I want to remind everybody that you can purchase the book at Moment's website. You can also come to the website and there's many articles about Elie Wiesel. You can learn more about the origins of the magazine. And we hope that you will join us next time, next Tuesday. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Elisha.
And thank you, Nadine and Suzanne.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us.